second speaker is Colter Mitchell from the University of Michigan, and he's going to talk about COVID-19 in a vulnerable population, results from the study of adolescence to adult neural development. Dr. Colter, or Dr. Mitchell.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And it's really nice to be here. This is our second year. I know this is the third year, but it's our second. I just have to say, one of the things that's it's really nice but hard is like all of these talks are so engaging that I get stuck in thinking about how to apply them, and then I realize, oh, I actually have to give the next talk. So that can be a little rough. But I also just want to acknowledge Chris Monk, who's in the back, and Helen Meyer, who's right over here, who are the other co-PIs of this project. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the data that we are collecting or have collected, will be collecting, but specifically we're going to talk a little bit more about findings on employment, especially essential work and mental health, as well as things like job loss and loss of income. All right, so just really quickly, this is a large data set, as you'll see in a second. There's a lot of different funders. Our specific U01 is mentioned is from NICHD, but a lot of it comes from NICHD and NIMH. And you'll see more about that. So the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing Study, I'll start with that just to describe a little bit more what this data set is. So this is primarily funded by NICHD. It's the longest continuously running national birth cohort study in the United States. And the reason why I'm talking about the data first is in part because I'm trying to get everyone kind of connected in. These data are publicly available. Everything we're going to present here is already released, either at Princeton, where the Future of Families is held, or ICPSR. I know they're working on even like our recent COVID data being released. But anyway, this is the longest continuously running national birth cohort study, around 5,000 births in 1998 to 2000, the representative of large children born in large US cities. And there was an oversample for non-marital births. So it's actually quite race ethnically diverse and has a wide range of SES as well. So it's been used for many, many years to study things like the effects of policy on child development. And the way that they do that is in part by having several different time points, and we'll kind of reference these. But most recently, the age 22 data, which is, again, all publicly available. So please go use it. But you can see different interviews with parents, primary caregivers, in-home assessments, even biological data collection. And then down at the bottom, our SAND COVID survey. So you might ask, well, so then why do you keep saying Future of Families and SAND? So SAND is a subsample of Future of Families. That's why we have to go in that order. It is a subset of primarily Midwestern cities, in Detroit, Toledo, Chicago, that we're measuring at 15, age 21, and age 24, and then some other cities that we've added later in 21 and 24. And as you can tell, the focus here is on the brain. So this has been working with Chris Monk and Luke Hyde now for several years, trying to bring together neuroscience and population science. And so in this case, it was to study the effect of poverty-related stressors on brain development. And so we have things like an MRI, which is rare in population-based studies, a lot of mental health assessments, adversity measures, and even things like genetics, epigenetics, and of course, COVID. So here's kind of another visualization of the data, just to talk about it. And then I promise we're going to get to essential worker results. So just to have a sense of how this works, you've seen like the birth through age 15. I've already mentioned that before. SAND was collected at 15 and 17. So that's the neuroimaging study. And then in 2020, we started collecting, early 2020, late 2019, our SAND 21 study. And it was going quite well. We had started to ramp up. And then, of course, as you have heard from a few other ones, March came along and kind of ended all of that. So suddenly this thing, which we have to bring them here to Ann Arbor to go into an MRI, can't happen anymore. So we took that opportunity to do online surveys of both the, we still call them children, but they're actually not the children, they're young adults at this point, and their parents. And so that is the COVID supplement, COVID study. And then a couple years later, the core study interviewed everyone, and we had COVID related questions that were added to that, COVID modules. So that's that follow-up. And then, so that we'll report on some of those data today. And then starting in June, and if you went, by the way, to our, to the poster session, you would have seen Quentin Jenkins over here present on what we will be doing starting in June in our next round of data collection. We're also quite happy, very pleased that Quentin is going to be starting a PhD program in sociology in the fall at Brown. So that's great. Paying dividends already. So we'll be mostly focusing on kind of age 21, which is in the middle, first year of the pandemic, and then a couple years later. Just so you have a general sense, the project goals and aims, we're really focusing one whole aim on kind of essential workers, non-essential workers, and individuals who lost their job, because that was a big portion of our data. Not intentionally, that's just the sample that it is, but we have a large percentage of that. And then as well as some intergenerational, because we have families, responses to COVID-19 exposure mitigation strategies, and then a lot of multi-level analyses of different policies and different COVID-19 case burden and things like that. So if anything, you might remember from last year that we presented a little bit on a study that was published using these data, but using neuroimaging data. So in this case, I'll just talk a little bit about it. So without getting into a ton of detail, this is using functional network connectivity, and a lot of work that, again, Chris Monk and Luke Hyde's labs have done, just examining different functional connectivity maps and finding kind of different groups of connectivity and showing that these different subgroups are actually differentially responsive to stress. And so we end up showing that indeed using that those different subgroups, we see different levels of anxiety and depression, but also see that in response to things like COVID-related stress, like job loss, income loss, and food insecurity due to COVID, that there was a greater response in terms of having higher levels of anxiety and higher levels of depression. So we wanted to continue on this, but broaden it out, because only the young adults have neuroimaging data. So we're moving to a slightly different group. We want to look at at essential work status and loss of income, loss of job due to COVID, and how that influences mental health cross-sectionally. That is in that first year of the pandemic, and also longitudinally. Can we see changes over time? So again, this is using that SAND COVID data, both the young adult, which I'll say young adult, YA, and what we often call the primary caregiver, who isn't a primary caregiver anymore because they're in their 20s, but we still think of it that way because that's what they were when they were living with them. And we have different worker statuses and different, perceived stress, depression index, and anxiety. So one of the things we could spend a lot of time on is talking about what is an essential worker? What does that look like? And in fact, if you have different definitions, it's not surprising. You get very different percentages, and it's a difficult thing. Another way we might frame this for ours is a frontline worker. And so when you look at the Economic Policy Institute, you can start to see different, that's what this chart is, different segments of the workforce and what percent were considered essential workers by their definition. And that's generally what we've used. Just to give you a sense of what that looked like. So about a third of our young adults were essential workers, around 50% of the parents were. And they were mostly things like package delivery, grocery or food production, caregiving, or medical. So that gives you a sense of what they're doing. But just for a moment, think back to what it was like to be an essential worker in the first year, right? So just remember hearing the stories. These are people who may not have been living with their families for fear that they would transmit the virus. Or they might be living in a different room and not really having any contact. You probably remember those stories. Just because they had a job doesn't mean that their hours weren't significantly reduced or that they lost a lot of income. So there was good things because you had a job and you didn't lose it, but at the same time, very stressful times. And sometimes they had to work extra hours. So it was a mixed bag to be in this position. So just as a general sense, without the essential worker component, did you lose income? You can see a lot of people in our study lost income due to COVID. They were unable to get work due to COVID, and they had or lost their job. And there, of course, as you would anticipate, significant differences by race and household income. So just looking cross-sectionally, I think one thing to keep in mind is, in general, we see this when we look over all of those years of data, it's very clear that everyone's anxiety and depression went up during COVID. That's not a surprise. Kind of across the board, everyone was experiencing that. But you can see that overall, young adults have higher stress scores and anxiety than primary caregivers, and young adults, or unemployed young adults and primary caregivers or parents have the highest stress scores. But in general, we found that at least in this the first year of the pandemic, there really wasn't a lot of statistically significant differences between essential workers, non-essential workers, and unemployed, although there was between the parents and the children. So we look at that and we think, okay, so there's small differences, not really statistically significant. What happens if we take those same things and we look forward? So now this is a couple years later, right? So it's still what they were in that first year and what happens. And in that case, we saw significant differences in depression for essential versus unemployed, but not for essential and non-essential. But it's opposite of maybe what you would think. So much higher levels of depression for those who were working during the pandemic 2 years later. But no significant differences in depressions for the parents. And although it looks like there's kind of this different pattern for anxiety, actually, they ultimately are not significantly different for anxiety. So let's talk a little bit more about this, though. Let's just, if we narrow it in, instead of looking at the essential worker status, if we look at whether or not they lost income during the pandemic due to COVID. Again, that's specifically the question was, did you lose income due to COVID? We didn't see any difference between lost income or job loss with anxiety, but we saw a very strong association with reporting losing income for young adults and depression, and actually weaker, but still significant for primary caregivers. So what's really fascinating about that is even when you control for whether or not they were depressed or anxious in that first year, when it was happening, that sort of thing will eliminate any essential worker associations. But even when you adjust for that, it still has a significant effect. Loss of income has a significant effect on later depression. And even when you adjust for whether or not they actually have income back, there's still an independent effect that we haven't been able to rule out yet. So that's what I was saying about this. And so as we're wrapping up here to stay on time, there's a lot of things we're trying to explore now a little bit more. And this is one of the things when it comes back to thinking about what is an essential worker or a frontline worker. Part of it is diving into not all essential workers had the same experience and trying to tease out what sorts of things maybe we should have been asking to find out what they were experiencing, how they were potentially having issues, or what it meant to lose income if you were living with your parents versus losing income while you're living by yourself. Those are some things that we're thinking of exploring. But yeah, there was ultimately little influence on that work status on mental health early in the pandemic. And I think that's partly because it is such a mixed bag. For some people, it was quite a good thing to have a job. For others, having that job was incredibly stressful. And trying to tease that out is going to be important. But even in the middle term, the influences seem to differ by cohort. So younger adults may have actually been, this might have a longer delayed effect. And that's especially true for depression. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I'm curious to see if that declines. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of literature suggesting when you have a significant loss or significant event that it can take around 2 years to kind of come back to normal. So maybe this is what we're seeing is the end of those 2 years, and maybe in another 2 years it'll be different, but that's something that we're going to be exploring in the future. And with that, thank you for your time.